Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked on Wolves. Today on the show, more Jaden McDaniels praise. Digging in a bit to the numbers, just how impactful has he been? Let's keep the Jaden McDaniels love going today on the show. We'll also look at the Western Conference tiebreakers for the Wolves. They're actually in a pretty good spot compared to the teams around them in terms of head-to-head tiebreakers. It's all upcoming on the show. Welcome in. You are Locked on Wolves.
You are Locked on Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome into the Locked on Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked on Wolves. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. Happy Thursday, everybody. The Timberwolves have 2 consecutive off days this week before taking on the Lakers Friday night in a really big game. Speaking of, I want to get to Western Conference tiebreakers later, but I want to open the show here today with Jaden McDaniels. Tons of J-Mac, big J-Mac love in this episode here today. First of all, though, a big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Locked On Wolves is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you listen to podcasts, you can find this show. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app, along with all the other Minnesota podcasts. That's on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. More great local sports coverage 24/7, and it's free. Download the Locked On Sports Minnesota app today on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can also follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves. That's Locked On T-Wolves. Don't forget the T. And also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. All right. Jaden McDaniels has been getting a ton of attention lately, and rightfully so. And it all kind of started, I think, at least nationally. Of course, Wolves fans have known about McDaniels' lockdown defense capabilities for some time. Although I will say, and I said this on the show the other day, I do think that his actual impact was overstated his first couple of years. I think it was more just impressive that a 19, 20-year-old was still as long, athletic, and talented and skilled defensively as he was. But the actual on-court impact is showing up in a big way this year. And I think a couple of weeks ago in that overtime win over Dallas, that it really, a light was shown on McDaniels when he and Anthony Edwards together locked down Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving and didn't even allow a shot in the final 10, 11 seconds of that game. But since then, everybody has kind of seen him on a much brighter stage, just in terms of, more eyeballs on him nationally. Of course, playing the TNT game on Tuesday helped a lot as well, right? People got to see Jaden McDaniels, and a national audience got to see him up close and personal, taking on Kawhi Leonard, and also offensively having a big game, scoring 20 points, which was only the second 20-plus point game, I guess fourth total this season, fourth 20-plus point game for Jaden McDaniels. But he did it on both ends of the floor in that game. Today, of course, I do want to focus on his defense. I mean, that's when you start talking about Jaden McDaniels, at least at this stage in his career, we start and end by talking about defense. And I decided to kind of dig. It's something I like to do when the Wolves have a couple consecutive days off, is dig into different lineup data and just kind of see, there's always a little bit of noise to it no matter what. But I think 2-man lineups are pretty fascinating. There's been some pretty interesting conclusions that we've been able to draw from that. Maybe not conclusions, but impactful tools to help draw conclusions, right? And so I dug into the 2-man data a little bit with McDaniels, and I was just kind of realizing, hey, this is all these numbers are positive. All these net rating numbers are positive. And in general, advanced metrics they think McDaniels is a good player, but he doesn't do enough efficiently and doesn't rebound enough for win shares to really like Jaden McDaniels, right? I'm not saying that win shares is the end all be all. I'm just saying that when you look at some of the advanced data, you wonder what is his real on-court impact? So you dig into it a bit further. If you look at all the 2-man lineup numbers, they all love Jaden McDaniels. And that's not a good way of saying that, because the data is what the data is, right? It's not a super complicated formula to find out what your net rating is in a 2-man lineup. But every single one of his 2-man pairings, except for 2 players who are no longer with the Wolves, are positive. It's absolutely fascinating. And here, okay, so let's do this. Let's go through these numbers. So Jaden McDaniels has played over 1,000 minutes with 3 Timberwolves players. One is Anthony Edwards. They have a collective net rating. Edwards and McDaniels together have played almost 1,600 minutes together through play on Tuesday. They have a positive rating of plus 3.7. McDaniels and Gobert are plus 1. The other player that's over 1,000 minutes is D'Angelo Russell. Obviously no longer with the team. They were a negative 0.6, so barely a negative in their two-man lineup. Then you go on down the list, and every single one is positive. Almost 800 minutes with Kyle Anderson, that's a plus 6.9. 500 minutes with Naz Reid, a plus 4.2. 473 minutes with Jaylen Noel, a plus 8.5, which, by the way, is actually, this is also interesting, his best plus minus of any player he's played more than 50 minutes with is with Jaylen Noel, his best net rating, I should say. And hold that thought, because I want to get back to Jaylen Noel. So go on down. I'm not going to literally list the entire roster. Take my word for it. You could go look at it at NBA.com. Every single one is a positive, except for D'Angelo Russell, and then you get towards the bottom, and in 82 minutes with Bryn Forbes, McDaniels is a negative 5.7. But neither Forbes or D'Angelo Russell's with the team anymore. The only other one would be 23 minutes with Wendell Moore Jr. at the very bottom. Let's not even count that. 23 minutes for the entire season together. But everybody else, a positive plus minus. Now back to Jaylen Noel. Go ahead and flip your filter to Jaylen Noel at NBA.com. And it's a completely different story, as you might expect. Noel's is a completely mixed bag. And you're probably wondering why I'm comparing McDaniels to Noel in terms of two-man data. Well, if you look at Noel's numbers, his only positives, or a better way to say this is, the better positive, the higher number, the higher net rating. It's a much easier way to say that. The higher the net rating for Noel, the better the perimeter defender that he's playing with. So Jaylen Noel's best net rating, actually his best ones are Garza and Karl-Anthony Towns in small minutes, right? 160 with Towns and 115 with Garza. Besides that, though, his best net rating is with Jaden McDaniels, a plus 8.5 in 473 minutes. His next best is with Anthony Edwards, a plus 7.7. And then his next best is his other positives are with Taurean Prince, Kyle Anderson, Jordan McLaughlin, guys who are good perimeter defenders. His negatives are with Austin Rivers, D'Angelo Russell, Bryn Forbes, and then you get down into not playing a lot of minutes. He also has a negative with Rudy Gobert, which we've talked about this before on the show. The Noel Gobert on the floor together just has never really felt right. Which is interesting because Noel and Karl-Anthony Towns have always been good together. Remember, I've talked about this plenty on the show. Last year, Noel and Karl-Anthony Towns actually had the Timberwolves' best two-man net rating. Towns and Noel did. And it's also very strong this year. Again, in limited minutes, it's a plus 9.3, which is his best mark, Noel's best mark. So, sidebar, when Towns gets back, Jaylen Noel may or may not still be in the rotation at this point, now that he's been injured and Nickeil Alexander-Walker's playing well. But I'd like to see it, if Noel's going to get minutes, it's got to be with Karl-Anthony Towns. Anyway, but the point here is that Jaden McDaniels has such a positive impact on the game that a guy who has a completely mixed bag in terms of net rating, and Noel is poor defensively, relies on another good perimeter defender, to be paired with in order to have successful minutes. And Jaden McDaniels is that guy. He's the guy who can lift everybody else around him. I was a little surprised to see that his net rating was positive with every single player except for D'Angelo Russell and Bryn Forbes. But it is. That's just how good Jaden McDaniels has been this season. The on-off numbers are good. They're not quite to pre-injury Jordan McLaughlin levels, but Jaden McDaniels has an extremely positive impact on the game and can pull up the perimeter defense of everybody else around him. And that's the main reason why, right? It's not an offensive rating. It's the net rating because the defense is so much better with Jaden McDaniels on the floor. And we'll get in a minute here. I want to get to the Bball-Index numbers, certainly the on-ball numbers, but also some of the off-ball numbers that we kind of forget about with McDaniels. And it's because he plays on the ball against high-usage players so frequently, but he's also a really good off-ball defender. He's just a fantastic all-around defender. And back to the original point, he brings up the floor of the defense when he's on the floor. The fact that all of his two-man pairings are positive is really, really impressive. You look at literally the best players in any given team, and that's not necessarily the case. And I guess, for example, I use Noel as an example because I think that the defensive impact is so obvious. But like, put in Anthony Edwards. I mean, D'Angelo Russell and Edwards had a negative plus minus. Actually, Edwards and Reed have a slight negative. Nas Reed have a slight negative net rating. Same with Rivers. Karl-Anthony Towns and Edwards have a negative net rating. Do the same thing with Towns. It's a similar exercise, right? But with Jaden McDaniels, everybody's got a positive 2-man net rating. It's absolutely fascinating. All right. Next, I want to get to the Bball-Index numbers as promised on Jaden McDaniels. We touched on a couple of them the other day, but I want to dig in a bit deeper. And then we'll get to the Western Conference tiebreakers because the Timberwolves are at a pretty good spot in terms of the tiebreakers. And a lot of that has to do with them playing to their competition like they have all season, right? So we'll get into all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at FanDuel. We're now past the midway point of the NBA season, and now is the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Then you can bet on everything from the money line to point scores, threes drained, and beyond. Wolves-Lakers Friday will be a ton of fun to bet on. I mean, I think three-pointers, like the Lakers are a better three-point shooting team now than they were, right? They've got Malik Beasley. D'Lo might play Friday. That'd be a fun one to look at. I haven't looked at the line for that one, but I'm guessing it's Lakers by like 1.5, right? I mean, the Wolves have the better record. The Lakers, though, are getting, I guess LeBron's going to be out, so maybe it won't be the Lakers' favorite, but it'll be, I mean, they won the other day, shorthanded, the Lakers did. So I think it'll be maybe Lakers by 1. But it's going to be a really fun game Friday night. Plus, FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same-game parlay. Don't miss the chance to get your no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, let's talk Bball-Index numbers for Jaden McDaniels. If you're not familiar, Bball-Index is a fantastic site. It's a subscription site. They're friends of Locked On, and the data is unbelievable. They pull in data from basically everywhere. So they actually have like all the catch-all stats. So like win shares, their own stat is LeBron. They pull in real plus minus from ESPN. They pull in box score plus minus from various places, and then they, like I said, they have their own proprietary stat, LeBron. And then they also just have a few other like evaluational tools that you won't find elsewhere. But we talked the other day about a Twitter account that had pulled together, I think it was NBA University, some of his best on-ball stats. And I want to touch on those again, but also just get into how crazy his all-around defense has been. Like, for instance, let's start here. A couple of these are numbers I mentioned the other day. Jaden McDaniels' interior defense, right? You don't think of him as, he's not like a traditional rim protector, right? He's not Rudy Gobert. He's not standing in the paint, blocking shots necessarily. But his overall interior defense is fantastic. Defended field goal percentage versus expected. So this is shots at the rim above or below what Second Spectrum would expect based on shot location with low samples regress. It does not adjust for who the shooter is. Doesn't really matter. He's 94th percentile. He drops opponent field goal percentage at the rim by almost 8 points. 94th percentile league-wide. That grades out as an A. Adjusted rim points saved per 75 possession. It's a measure of points saved on shots at the rim by the defender based off their ability to contest shots, the player's ability to contest shots, with smaller samples regress with league and the roll average rim defensive field goal percentage values. All that to say, how many rim points is he saving per 75 possessions? 88th percentile. It's an A-. Rim protection overall, a plus 1.33. That's 93rd percentile or an A. Again, you don't necessarily think of him as a rim protector. And you go into the actual block numbers, and he grades out as Bs and B pluses here. And again, he's not a center. So to be grading out that well, most of the A's in this category are centers. In rim contest per 75 possessions, blocks per 75 possessions, he's a B and a B plus in those categories, which is pretty incredible. Also related to his matchups, we talked about this the other day too. He's primarily guarding the best player on the floor. He spends 21% of his time guarding usage tier 1 players. That's 85th percentile league wide. In fact, the other day, the way I phrased it was, he spends more than half his time guarding usage tier 1 or 2 players. Which, like, how many guys are in that boat? Not very many. He spends 9% of his time guarding primary ball handlers, 13% of his time guarding secondary ball handlers, and 17% of the time guarding slashers, which usually those are some of the league's best scorers, right? The most talented scoring players fall into the slasher category, which is, I mean, again, incredible. It just underscores what he's being asked to do. He also, according to Bball-Index, has an off-ball pest badge. And I should have pulled up the definition, but it should be pretty self-explanatory, right? And then in addition to the interior defense, Jaden McDaniels' perimeter defense is also incredible. His on-ball perimeter defense, 86th percentile, is a plus 1.09. That's an A-. His three-point contest per 75 possessions, 81st percentile. That's an A-. Ball screen navigation, we've talked about this before. He's one of the best in the league at getting around and through ball screens. And of course, his length helps a lot with that, right? That's the primary, benefit in terms of his skill set to navigate screens. But he also plays hard defensively, right? Getting through screens is as much effort as anything else. But then he's also able to use his length to contest around screens, to bother ball handlers. And I mean, it's just, it's really otherworldly. And this is also really interesting. This is a new thing at Bball-Index. I haven't seen this before, but there's a matchup-adjusted defensive feet per minute played. It shows the distance traveled relative to expectations based on his matchups that a player has throughout the season. So it seeks to answer, does the player cover a lot of ground for the matchups that they've had? The answer is yes. Almost 20 defensive feet per minute played for Jaden McDaniels. That is 93rd percentile, and instead of grading it out, they have it as 859% more than average. So McDaniels is working his tail off, and a lot of that is getting around and through screens and navigating, like when he's guarding, I mean, I guess usually Edwards was guarding Paul George, but the other night, who was it that, Klay Thompson, guarding Klay Thompson, who's just, zooming in and out of, weaving in and out of these of screens when the Warriors are setting pin downs and trying to run him off staggered screens and all this stuff. McDaniels is navigating those screens to try and contest the shot, and he does that better than anybody in the league. So you name the defensive statistic, Jaden McDaniels is there. And it's because of that all those two-man lineup, the net ratings are so impressive for McDaniels. And offensively, he's getting there, right? Like, the Bball-Index numbers are not great, but he's gotten better as a three-point shooter, right? His overall three-point percentage is now over 38%, which is a big improvement for him. He's still just a catch-and-shoot guy, but that's totally fine. That's what his role is. In fact, his three-point shot quality, by the way, on Bball-Index, he grades out as an A. Three-point shot quality is an overall measure of shot quality combining shot location, openness, and type, which means he's shooting threes when he's open in a catch-and-shoot situation. And we talked about this the other day. His three-point rate is actually down this season because he's been more comfortable pump fake drive, pump fake pass, swing the ball around the perimeter, like making that quick next decision versus where he used to always, he'd either just shoot the contested three because that was easier and he wasn't going to turn it over, or he'd dribble into a contested two, and he's not doing that this year. He's making the decision more quickly on the offensive end, and he's usually making the right decision. And it's okay that his turnover rate is ticked up slightly because his assist rate is up significantly. His free throw rate is up. Not that he's getting to the line a ton, but he's getting into the paint more often offensively. He's showing more confidence in doing that. And even after he puts the ball on the floor, he's been a willing passer this year. And all that means that when he does shoot a three, the shot quality, again, is 91st percentile in the league. It's an A. And that's why his three-point percentage is up, because he's taking better threes. He's taking less threes, but he's taking better threes. And he's doing everything else better as well. So he's been a positive offensive contributor this season, which we have not always seen from him in the past. I think that we've kind of glossed over occasionally some of his shortcomings because the defensive potential has been so tantalizing. But by and large, like, we've seen an across-the-board improvement from Jaden McDaniels this season. There's no question about that. And also, by the way, some of the some of the other, metrics back that up as well. Like he still has a top 10 defensive real plus minus on ESPN.com among players that are listed as power forwards. That's a pretty good individual metric, but it's in the same neighborhood as Pascal Siakam and Julius Randle and PJ Washington and guys that get attention for being better than Aaron Gordon, right? There's other factors that play into that number, and I would argue he's a better defender than a couple of the guys ahead of him. I would say he's a better defender and overall player than Jabari Smith Jr., right? With the Houston Rockets. So none of these stats by themselves are going to tell the full story. So I'd encourage you when evaluating Jaden McDaniels, pull in some of this other stuff too, because eventually these metrics are going to catch up when he starts rebounding a little better. And when the Timberwolves start as a team playing overall better, right? Some of these metrics are going to be impacted and it'll start to look better and better and better. But the eye test would tell you also, it backs up all these numbers related to rim defense, perimeter defense, screen navigation. Jaden McDaniels is a really impactful defender. And nationally now, there's a national audience that's really starting to figure this out. All right, let's close the show here today by looking at some of these matchups in the Western Conference, what the Wolves' record is against teams right around them, and where they still have a little bit of work to do. But the good news is, by the way, they have not lost any tiebreakers yet, and we'll break that down here in a minute. All right, the Minnesota Timberwolves through play on Wednesday after a relatively full NBA slate with, of course, no Timberwolves game. Timberwolves are alone, actually, in 8th place in the Western Conference. They're a half game behind Dallas, who's played one less game than them and has one less loss. And they're a half game ahead of the Utah Jazz and the New Orleans Pelicans, both of who have also played one less game than the Wolves, but have won one less game. So the Wolves are alone in 8th place. They're also, as we always need to, point out, they're only 4.5 out of the 4 spot where the Phoenix Suns are. They're also only 2.5 out of the 11 spot where the Lakers are. Of course, the Wolves play the Lakers Friday. So there's still only 4 games separating the 4 seed from the 11 seed in the Western Conference and 4.5 separating 12 from 4 if you want to include the Blazers. If you want to include the Thunder, there's only 5.5 games separating the 13th seed from the 4 seed. So all those teams are still in it in the Western Conference. Tiebreakers come into play in a really big way. And we haven't focused on it a ton this season. I try and bring it up when the Wolves have these Western Conference matchups. But I have some great news. The Timberwolves have not lost any tiebreakers yet in the Western Conference. There's a couple that they can't win, but they haven't lost any yet. So let's go down the list. The Timberwolves have played the Phoenix Suns 3 times. They beat them twice, lost to them twice and won once, with one still to play against Phoenix. Now, of course, the Suns, Kevin Durant made his debut the other night. That's not going to be an easy task, but if the Wolves win, they then there is no tiebreaker, right? It's 2-2 in the series, and the Wolves are only 2.5 behind the Suns, so that could matter. But they have a chance to tie that tiebreaker, if you will. Next is the Golden State Warriors. They're 5th in the Western Conference. The Wolves are 1 game behind the Warriors. Same thing against the Warriors. The Wolves are 1-2 against the Warriors this year with 1 game to play. So they have a chance to tie that tiebreaker. The Clippers and Mavericks, the Wolves just beat both of them. They're done with them for the season and won the tiebreaker. The Wolves are 2-1 against the Clippers. That's another reason I said this on Tuesday, or I guess it was Wednesday's show, why the Tuesday win was such a big deal. And they're 2-1 against the Mavericks. So they win both those tiebreakers. And this is part of another conversation, but related to the first couple segments today, is how good the Wolves' isolation defense is. And those teams love to play iso ball with Luka and Kyrie in Dallas, Kawhi and Paul George in LA. Jaden McDaniels and Anthony Edwards are up for that challenge. So if the Wolves take on the Clippers or Dallas in the playoffs, get ready for some fantastic individual on-ball defense. The teams the Wolves struggle with, of course, are the teams that have more free-flowing offenses like a Golden State, a lot of pick and rolls like Phoenix. The Wolves aren't, they're better as a pick and roll defensive team this year because of Rudy Gobert, but they have some work to do still. Teams like Utah that don't have like one guy that they're just going to go ISO with, but they're doing stuff to, run marketing off screens and things like that. The Wolves struggle with a team like Utah. But with the Clippers and Mavericks, where you'd be worried about their top line offensive talent, the Wolves just lock in and play one-on-one defense. And those matchups, I talked about the Dallas matchup being positive. I actually think I talked about it on Locked On NBA a couple weeks ago, or it was the Locked On Today show. about how I like the Dallas matchup for Minnesota, a potential playoff series matchup, or maybe even play in. Hopefully not. But the Wolves and Mavs, I don't hate that matchup for Minnesota. Going on down the list, so LA, the Clippers, and Dallas, where they are relative to the Wolves. The Clippers are 1 game ahead of the Wolves in the 6th spot. Dallas is, again, a half game ahead of the Wolves. The Wolves own the tiebreaker against both of those teams. So if they finish with the same record, the Wolves win the head-to-head, and they vault above the Clippers and the Mavericks. The Utah Jazz are a half game behind the Timberwolves. The Wolves are also done with the Mavericks, and Utah Jazz, not the Mavericks. The Utah Jazz are behind the Timberwolves. Wolves are done with the Jazz. They tied the season series 2-2, which was disappointing, right? That's a team the Wolves expect to be much better than, and also should have won at least one of those 2 losses to Utah. But the Wolves and Jazz have split the season series 2-2. The Pelicans are behind them. The Wolves have only played the Pelicans twice. They've split those 2 games, and they only have them one more time, and it's actually the last game of the regular season. So it could be a huge game. Pelicans are in something of a free fall. They've righted the ship a bit in the past couple days, but no Zion Williamson, of course, for an extended period of time. So we'll see. But I would expect them to still be in the play-in battle at the end of the season. So that could be a really big final game of the regular season, both for the actual standings and then also for the tiebreaker, because, again, they've split the 2 games thus far. Wolves, Pelicans, both have been really close, entertaining games. If you go further down the list, the Wolves have only played the Lakers once. That, of course, changes Friday night. The Wolves beat the Lakers in the first game way back early in the season. They have 2 more against LA, including Friday. So they have a chance. If they win Friday, they'll win that matchup. They'll win that tiebreaker. That one I'd be worried about because, depending on how long LeBron's out, LA's looming. And that D'Lo and Beasley and Vanderbilt, those guys are motivated to play against the Timberwolves. The Wolves are just 1-2 against Portland. Now, Portland is currently not well out of the playoff picture, but they are 12th in the Western Conference, 2 games behind the Wolves. The Wolves are just 1-2 against Portland this season. And the Thunder, who are just a little behind the Blazers, their Thunder are 3 games behind the Wolves and have now lost 5 in a row. So they are certainly struggling. SGA is missing some time now. So they may be kind of morphing back into the tank mode that I think a lot were expecting from them. But the Wolves have won the season series against them 3-1. So the Wolves have won the season series already against the Clippers, Mavericks, and Thunder. They have a chance to come back and tie the Suns and Warriors. They tied the season series and are done with the Utah Jazz. They're tied and have a chance to win against the Pelicans. And they're also, I guess, losing the season series against Portland with a chance to tie it. And then the Lakers, we don't know yet. They're up 1-0 with 2 to play against LA. So I would say overall, considering that the Wolves have not actually lost any tiebreakers yet, and we're sitting here on March 2nd with 20 games to play, 19 games to play, not a bad spot to be in terms of Western Conference tiebreakers. It's actually the East that the Wolves have struggled with at times. And of course, the very bottom of the West, some of those losses against Houston and San Antonio that are a bit unsightly. But overall, the tiebreaker situation is a really positive one for the Wolves. All right, on Friday's show, we'll preview the Wolves-Lakers matchup. It is very much a new-look Lakers team. We'll talk about the injury report. D'Angelo Russell's been out now for about a week. And the reports are he's trying to play Friday. And he wants to, D'Lo wants to play against the Timberwolves on Friday night. So we'll see how the Wolves respond. Also to 2 off days in LA. I mean, who knows? So we'll talk about that on Friday's show. Among other things, we'll get you ready for the weekend. The Wolves also play Saturday. So it's a big weekend of games. I believe that's the Kings on Saturday night. So we'll actually preview both of those matchups and, relative to the Western Conference standings as well, and everything else that happens this week in the West, as I think standings watch is now that we're in March. It's a very real thing we have to consider here. So all that will be on Friday's show. We'll get you ready for the weekend. We'll do the live postcast with Marnie Gellner following Wolves Lakers late Friday as well, for those of you that stay up for the game, and then also hopefully for the postcast on the Locked On Sports Minnesota YouTube channel. Of course, you can find this show anywhere you listen to podcasts. A big thank you to those that do make Locked On Wolves your first listen. We're on YouTube. We're on all your favorite audio platforms. We're also on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can also follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Now make your second listen the Game to Game NBA podcast. Every moment, every top performance, and every result. Locked On Game to Game covers every game from across the NBA with local analysis that only Locked On can deliver. Follow Game to Game on Locked On NBA. Available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.